Plainview, are you out there? First calling Plainview. I'm looking for Plainview. There you go. They're up now. She's up now, just one person later. Just one of you, or is everybody else hiding off camera? Okay. There you go. Now we've got some folks coming in. Everybody's up. Has everybody signed in already? Or is it just kind of moving around slowly? So I can look at names. Okay. Who's got notes? What was the last thing in your notes? It's been a while, hasn't it? How long has it been? More, a week? Yeah, a little over a week. So we're going to do some reviewing just to figure out where we are here as soon as I get this thing cranked up. So I think we shouldn't talk and try and do this at the same time. So what happens when you start having to use really, really complex passwords. I need a little assistant to follow me along and tell me what my passwords are so I can remember them. We will talk about explorers. We talked about conditions in Europe. We didn't get all that far. I looked at recordings of our class, what is it, a week ago today. And we were talking about the conditions and all of that. So we'll work our way through the Portuguese and the Spanish and try and get all the way to the French by the end of this period. So we're going to have to kind of push a little bit. The notes are all, you have all sorts of notes about it in your Unit 1. By the way, I have been grading I've graded most of the quizzes, but I found it necessary, and not just this class, I mean, I found it necessary to make extra comments in a lot of them. So it's taking me a lot longer than I normally would take to grade quizzes. Normally you're going to see it almost instantaneously after you take it. But in this case, since it's short answer, I have to write about each answer as we go along. But you'll get it. I noticed a common mistake that people were making on the quiz. Some of them were doing those readings and you were looking at the introductory part and thinking that was what that guy said. That's not what that guy said, that's what I said. The part after the introduction, I thought most people could tell because the typeface changes and everything else. But some people were getting that confused a little bit in their answers. It was tough reading, and we won't do anything else that's anything like that from here on out. The quizzes will all be, I think, all multiple choice from here on out. But you can learn something from the experience anyway. If you didn't do real well on that quiz, you learn some things. One is, if I write down there, I strongly suggest that you have notes ready in front of you. When you take this quiz, take it seriously. There were some people that tried to do the quiz without doing the reading, or putting the reading in front of them while they were taking the quiz. That didn't work too well either. And the wording is a little bit convoluted because there are people from 300 years ago who were using different vocabulary, different spelling, different construction. So it was a little bit hard to read. Basically, Hackley just listed a whole bunch of reasons for going to the Americas: resources, competition with Spain in particular, although he mentioned other countries. Some of the resources he was talking about, not just soil, but he was talking about things like timber. Timber was very important to the English for their navy. They needed materials for their navy. Unemployment, he mentions that, giving people jobs. So it's pretty straightforward. And it was to convince Queen Elizabeth to support colonization. In the Hales writing about enclosure, you kind of can get confused, really. You can get confused right off the bat, because he talks about enclosure, and he says, if you're enclosing land that nobody's on, who cares? It's okay. It makes it more efficient. But what he's complaining about is enclosing land that other people are already using, putting them out of a job, putting them out of a home, and all that sort of thing. So sometimes it sounds like he's speaking well about enclosure, but he's not. And when he talks about prices, sometimes he's talking about good prices of things like eggs. I saw that in a lot of answers, believe it or not. He's talking about how they should be. He's not talking about how they are if you have enclosure, because he argues that if you have enclosure, then these landlords now are in total control of that land and what goes on it, so they can set whatever outrageous prices they want to set. That was the point he was making about enclosure. We had a war like that in our country many, many years after that, about using barbed wire and closing off the open range. And there was violence and bloodshed over that, by the way, in America. There were actual cattle wars and things like that caused by people stringing up barbed wire. But that's what I was showing you, was what enclosure did. And the main thing that we care about, it, number one, created unemployment. Number two, caused a lot of people to go to the cities looking for food, get closer to the marketplace. And so it gives you a whole bunch of unemployed people and a whole bunch of people that don't have any land, who have all sorts of motivation to take the risk of going to the Americas. That's what that's all about. And the other one was more simple, the one about, that was written by a guy that was in the first venture at Roanoke, talking about the Indians. The Indians apparently thought that the colonists had some connection with the spirits or something and could create illness. We realized what was really happening is that those colonists were immune, but the Indians weren't. And they tried to actually get the colonists to weaponize that and go over and kill their enemies off. That's not the only time you'll ever hear about that. We'll hear about that in the Americas too. Anyway, so much for the quiz. You'll see your results in the next day or so. By the way, there's a Unit 2 quiz up. Those people who thought they didn't need to do the readings know that now. This one's about slavery. Read the entry on slavery, printed there in front of you, and then read the 3 little one-page things, blurbs about different aspects of slavery before you take that quiz. And then you should get an A on the quiz. You should get a perfect paper. Okay? This time it's multiple guess, so it should be a little bit easier and a little bit faster, but you have less time to do it. I can't remember how much time you have to do this one. It will be due once again on Friday, and I think I'm going to make them all due on Friday. That's a change in my normal process, but I think that'll work out better. That way you're not thinking about it over the weekend. You have your weekend to yourself, as far as my class is concerned anyway. Okay, let's get into these things. I told you how much we had to do, and now I'm taking up time with other things. I'm going to put up 3 sets of slides here so I can jump across. The first one will be the Portuguese and the Spanish, and you have that. And I think I did a set of a PowerPoint about the French and the English in one PowerPoint. Can't remember if I crammed it together or not. Nobody here, you've got your computer. Are you looking at, look in the notes for Unit 1, Unit 1 lectures. Does it have the Portuguese and the Spanish is one PowerPoint, and then the French and the English is another one? If it does, that's basically what I'm doing here. I'm going to break them down.
You said Unit 1, right? Yeah, I have that one.
Okay. We're going to do the, I seriously doubt we're going to get to the French and the British, but we're going to try really hard. Now what you'll find with each one of these groups is I'm going to go back kind of to the beginning with each one. So we'll back up, we'll go forward, and we'll back up again and cover the next one. Except the case of the Spanish and the Portuguese, because they were basically ahead by 100 years. When they're doing their colonization already, the French and the British, and to some extent the Dutch and Germans and people like that, they're all busy with things that are going on inside their country. And although they're aware of what the Spanish and the Portuguese have done, they're not ready to compete with them. Spain, at this stage of the game, was the world's greatest power. They had the world's largest standing army, best army tactics and leadership and all of that. That will change. So let's look at the Portuguese and the Spanish. The Portuguese expansion starts with a family called the Aves, or Aves. Let me put it up so you can see it a little bit more clearly. It's still going to be blurry for you guys out in Plainview. John I of Portugal will start it by having his son, Henry, that we call Henry the Navigator, Prince Henry, develop exploration. Prince Henry will be a really good advisor for his father. His father trusts him. He's not trying to steal the throne from his daddy or anything like that. He advises him to go to Africa for a number of reasons. You got these names and faces memorized? Good, we're skipping that. Here are his basic reasons. Let me see if I can get them up for everybody out there in Never Never Land. They were having trouble with pirates off the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula, giving them trouble going in and out of the Mediterranean. They knew there was gold out there. They wanted that. They knew it was coming across the Sahara Desert because the Arabs seemed to have a lot of it. The Arab traders did. They wanted to maybe get to the source of that and not have to go through the middleman. They wanted to get slaves. They were used to the slaves that they'd acquired during the Reconquista, during the fighting of the Moors, the Iberian Peninsula. It wasn't based on ethnicity or anything like that. It was based on where you could get them, what was available. On the Iberian Peninsula, when this exploration started, there were slaves of all colors and flavors. Scandinavians, Slavic people, poor white folks that happened to be sailing past the Barbary Coast and got captured and enslaved by them, and then were used on the Iberian Peninsula by the Moors. And then, of course, when the Moors were defeated in battle, whenever they were defeated in battle, you had Moorish prisoners of war who became slaves for the Iberian Christians, including the Portuguese. When the Portuguese are kind of out of the fighting, they're looking for more slaves. They're getting used to them. They're starting to grow sugar on some of the islands offshore. They realize that the Moors came from North Africa, so they're thinking, what if we just go over there and get some there? They're also, and probably this is the number one reason, trying to find another route to get to the Far East, to the Indies, to India, China, because the Ottoman Empire was kind of blocking the way if you went out the back end of the Mediterranean Sea. So they're gonna start working their way down the African coast, trying to get around that continent. They have no idea how long it is. They'll be very careful about it at the beginning, and they're gonna try and find another route, this time over sea. It's a lot cheaper to go over sea than it is to go over land. Trade routes in Africa, look at those. Those are all crossing the Sahara Desert. They're bringing gold up, among other things, they're bringing gold up from the Bight of Africa, that part of Africa that kind of sticks out like an armpit. It's coming from an area now called Ghana. Back then there was a kingdom of Ghana, but it was in a slightly different location. They're still digging gold up there. When I was over in Ghana at the end of last century, in the 90s, they were still actively taking gold out of the ground there. Not in great quantities, but enough to be worth paying people to do it. There's Henry the Navigator. As a result of the good advice he gives his father, he's going to be the governor of the Order of Christ. It's kind of a form of knighthood. All the profits of trading within the areas he discovers will be his. He'll have the sole right to authorize people to take expeditions south along the African coast. He's in control of the very southern tip of Portugal. So why be king? You get all the profit and you don't have to be king. And that's what he did. And he'll die in 1460. By the time he dies, the explorers will only be partway around the northwestern Atlantic coast of Africa, but they will continue on until the late 1500s, and they'll get to the southern tip of Africa. That's about how far they went while he was alive, down to Cape Bojador. One of the things that Prince Henry's going to do is develop technology. Ships that are good for going along the coast, and more sophisticated navigation. Now, they already had compasses. They didn't work really well on ships because ships rock. And until they figure out a gimbal system to keep the compass flat, it doesn't work real well. Shipbuilding. They're going to build lighter weight ships that can go up these different river estuaries. They're going to build ships that can go almost into the wind because they develop aerodynamic sails. Original sailing ships, the ones the Phoenicians used on the Indian Ocean and in the Mediterranean and places like that, they were just a big screen that you put up on a mast, and if the wind was blowing in the right direction, it pushed you. But sailing ships, modern sailing ships, are not pushed by the wind. Does that surprise you? They're pulled by the wind. It's aerodynamic lift that's created passing over the sails. Just like air going over the wing of an airplane causes lift for the airplane, this is going to cause pulling of your sails because that aerodynamic lift. Now, if you get into physics, you have things called vectors, where you have opposing forces pulling in different directions. In the case of this, they're going to develop aerodynamic sails, and they're going to develop what they call keels. They're like a ridge on the bottom of the ship. Some of them got really big in sailing ships in modern times. They kept the ship from sliding sideways when the wind wanted it to go sideways. So the ship stays aimed in a certain direction. The wind is going to push the body of the ship to the side, but the wind's also going to draw the ship in a slightly different direction. And you average all those pulling forces, and you end up with a vector that's kind of in between them. And with aerodynamic sails, there's some of the sailing stuff. Let me see if I can find you a... There's a caravel. That's that lighter weight ship. A couple of tons is all that thing weighed. But those lateen rigged sails, and that's what they call them. Write that down because it pops up on an examiner quiz here and there. Lateen rigged. They were really good if the wind was blowing from your right to your left, but if it was blowing from your left to your right, then all of a sudden it flattened against the mast and it didn't work so good. So eventually they're going to have sails that go from the mast back, and you don't have that problem. But they're all aerodynamic. And they lift and they pull that ship in one direction. You notice the ship's not going exactly in the direction the sails are puffed out towards. That's that vector thing that I was telling you about. It's resisting going sideways. But once they developed aerodynamic sails, they could sail much closer to the wind, so you didn't have to sit around and wait for the wind to be going in exactly the direction you wanted to go in. A lot of other things they discovered. They discovered sea currents, something called gyres. Did we talk about that? I think I did. In one of the classes before? Basically, gyres is a tendency of all the major oceans to rotate in a certain direction. And they rotate because of the rotation of the Earth. The rotation of the Earth versus inertia, which tends to resist motion. So what you end up with these giant gyres, there were smaller currents, but the gyres were on the major oceans. In the North Atlantic, I didn't talk about this before? Okay. In the North Atlantic, the gyres go clockwise. In the South Atlantic, the gyres go counterclockwise. If you want to demonstrate this, fill up your sink, pull out the plug, watch the water go down, it always rotates in the same direction. It's true for your sink, it's true for your toilet bowl, and it's true for the ocean. Okay, they figured that out. They figured out how to use the winds and the currents so they could navigate and actually hope to get home. One of the things they figured out early on off of Africa, they were always afraid to go too far south because they couldn't get home. Not because they couldn't find home, but because the wind wouldn't blow that way. The currents wouldn't help them. But by accident, I think some captain sailed off the shore pretty far and discovered a current that went the way he wanted it to go. They called it the Volta do Mar Largo. It's not going to make a whole lot of difference later on when they're going longer distances. But right around the early places they went to, north of Cape Verde in Africa, they'll use that to get home. Just for fun, and they actually believed in this, they were also, one of their other motivations, they were looking for gold, they were looking for slaves, they were looking for the lost kingdom of Prester John, which was supposed to be a place kind of like Eden that had everything you ever wanted in it, including what old people always want, the fountain of youth. They never did quite find it, and then they decided it wasn't in Africa, and they looked in Central Asia, and they didn't find it there. The Spanish are looking for something almost that good they call El Dorado, right? The city of gold. Same kind of legend. They looked all over the Americas for it, never found it. Ponce de Leon looked all over Florida looking for the fountain of youth. He finally died of old age, so I guess he didn't find it. Now, after Prince Henry's gone, 1487, you're going to have a guy named Bartholomew or Bartolomeo, if you want to speak Portuguese, Diaz, and he's going to get all the way to the southern tip, almost the southern tip of Africa. They're called the Cape of Good Hope. It's a little bit to the west of the actual southern tip. That's as far as he's going to get. His crew wouldn't go along with going any further. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama is going to get all the way to the southern tip of Africa, go beyond that, up the east coast of Africa, and then over to India. And that opens the door. And the Portuguese are going to go in large numbers. A lot of different explorers we're not going to talk about. I'd like you to remember da Gama's name, and I'd like you to remember Diaz's name, and I'd like you to remember Prince Henry's name, and some of the technological things that Prince Henry did. There's some of the places they went. Don't know how clearly it looks to you on the screen. I don't put it up on this screen. I guess I could, except that it'll just be blurry. India, they're going to set up trading posts in India. They call them factories. That's a little confusing. They keep talking about factories. You wonder, what are they manufacturing? Factories weren't about manufacture. Factories came from the word for work, factor. They were trading posts. Did we lose anybody? No, we still have plain view. They went on around the Bay of Bengal, the Andaman Sea, all the way over to the Malay Peninsula, down to the Malaccan Straits, and then off to the Spice Islands, and north to what is now Indochina or Vietnam, and all the way to China, and also all the way over to Japan. They did all of that by certainly by 1550. They got to Japan, I think, 1543. They got to China before that. And they're going to start setting up outposts there. They set one up in Vietnam, I would call Vietnam now, in a place called Phi Pho, which doesn't exist anymore because there was a little bay at the end of a river that was good for small ships, and then it filled up with silt, and then it wasn't good for anything, so they moved to another place. Probably some of the first missionaries in East Asia went to Phi Pho. Just to confuse you a little bit, one of the places they passed through, and I mentioned it, they went past the Malay Peninsula and an island, a giant island called Sumatra, which is now part of Indonesia. That's the Straits of Malacca, or the Strait of Malacca. They're going to set up an outpost on the Malay Peninsula. The Chinese wanted an outpost too. The Chinese wanted to dominate that, so they're going to be competing a little bit with the Chinese. And then they're going to go all the way over to a group of islands that we call the Spice Islands, but they call the Moluccas. So you got Malacca and Maluku, just to confuse you a little bit. In the middle of the Spice Islands, there's a tiny little island called Ambon. And on that island was the only source in the world of cloves. And some of those islands in the Spice Islands were the main world source of nutmeg and some other things. And those were used medicinally as well as for food and that sort of thing. The Chinese already knew where that stuff was. The Chinese already had that. A lot of Europeans thought all that stuff came from China, but it really didn't. Now Spain's going to join in after they finish polishing off the Moors at Granada. That's a painting of the surrender. I'm sure it didn't look like that, but that's what the artist was commissioned to draw, something that looked noble and really neat. Right after, by the way, Granada surrendered in January of 1492. Queen Isabella and her husband are going to sign off on the Alhambra Decree, which tells the people on the Iberian Peninsula, on their part of the Iberian Peninsula, either be Catholic or be gone. So all the Jews that were there, and there were a lot of Jews there, there were a lot of course, Islamic people still there. All of them were either forced either to convert to Catholicism or get out on pain of death eventually. About 200,000 Jews converted. Somewhere between 40 and 100,000 of them were expelled, and who knows how many people who were practitioners of Islam converted. Some of them kind of had their fingers crossed. That's why they had the, when they converted, okay, I'm a good Catholic now, kind of like I did. And that's why they have the Inquisition, to find out if they really converted or not. Questioning and that sort of thing, sometimes a little bit more than just simple questioning. They made waterboarding sound like it was fun sport. After they defeated the Moors, and they were interested in competing with the Portuguese and getting the goodies from the Far East, the Spanish are going to get involved in this too, and they're going to listen to a fellow by the name of Christopher Columbus, who's been banging on the door for some years now, trying to get someone to put up the money so he can try out his theory that if he goes straight west, he'll get to China. He was self-taught. This happens sometimes when you're self-taught. So he understood the principles of the world being round and all of that, but he didn't understand his math well enough to calculate the circumference of the world and figure out the distances. And so he's going to be way off when he's calculating how far he has to go and how long it will take to get to China if he goes straight west. Of course, you and I know, in retrospect, he never got there. He got to the Americas. He's going to make 4 voyages. The important thing about this is that he opened the floodgates for people to go to the Americas. And although their main purpose in going that direction was to get to the Far East, they found some stuff of value in the Americas, and they're going to start flooding into the Americas. Spain will colonize, the Portuguese will colonize to a lesser extent, and then other countries will follow behind them, almost 100 years behind them. So, this is a hint I'm putting up on the board right now. That's Alexander VI, Pope Alexander VI, formerly known as Roderick de Borgia y Borgia, which means that his mommy and daddy were basically from the same family. I had a friend named Garcia y Garcia, and I used to, that's Castellano Spanish, it would be Garcia y Garcia. In Mexican Spanish. I used to make fun of him about that. Did your daddy marry his sister? And he said, no. It wasn't. They were just both named Garcia. There's going to be a dispute between the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the only higher authority than the kings is the Pope. And they're going to say, settle this fight. The Portuguese say, we have a monopoly on China now. And the Spanish say, not so fast. And the Pope's got to solve this problem, and he does it kind of with the wisdom of Solomon. You all know about the wisdom of Solomon. Do you know the story about Solomon and the two women that claimed the baby? No? Didn't go to Sunday school? King Solomon had these two women appear, and he said, I can't divide this baby between the two of you. So if you both fight over this, what I'm going to do is, pulls out a sword and he said, I'll just cut that baby in half and you each have a half. And what he got was a reaction from one of the women said, no, let her have the baby. And Solomon said, you're the one that really loves that child, you must be the real mother. And he gave the baby to the real mother. Well, the Pope's trying to do this with the world. So he's going to split the whole world in half. He draws a line down the map. It looks like this. Excuse me. This is my third class in a row, and I'm starting to wear out. That dotted line is the line he drew. The Spanish and the Portuguese went off to a little town called Tordesillas in Spain, had some wine, redrew the line slightly, and that becomes the Treaty of Tordesillas. That solved the problem between Portugal and Spain about the world. They're not even thinking about any other country. They're dividing the world between Portugal and Spain. Portuguese can go to the east of that line. The Spanish can go to the west of that line. What is the logical problem with that as a solution, as a permanent solution? Come on, guys, think about it. Spanish can go west, Portuguese can go east. What's going to happen? They're going to meet on the other side. Or else we're going to have another problem. And they did. So in 1529, now the Treaty of Tordesillas happens in 1494, about a year and a half after Columbus made his first trip. The Treaty of Zaragoza, once again named after a little town in Spain that they had this negotiation in. And they settled what's going to happen on the other side of the world. On the other side of the world, the line's not so nice and straight. It's a little crooked. Why? Because when they went all the way around the world, they passed each other. They didn't meet each other. So the Spanish got to the Philippines, which is a little bit past where the Portuguese got to the Spice Islands. So the line on that side is a little crooked. Who cares? The Spanish held on to the Philippines for a long time. The Portuguese held on to the Spice Islands for a while, but the English and the Dutch are going to dispute that when they get to exploring. So Alexander. Columbus's second voyage, once again, is going around an island called Juana, named after the princess, the heir to the throne of both Castile and Aragon. They called her Juana the Mad, and she was not angry, but the other kind of mad. He's going to go past the islands that become, well, one that becomes Puerto Rico, and back to Hispaniola, where he'd been before, and back to Spain. After his first trip, he doesn't have any trouble raising money to go again. The Queen showers honors on him. Everybody wants to invest. So he has more and more ships. He makes a total of 3 trips. While he's doing it, and I don't know why I have Amerigo Vespucci's name down there, but he's one of the people that also explored and mapped, especially along the northern coast of South America. Columbus is always going to believe that he reached the outskirts of China, or the outskirts of the East Indies. He dies believing that. Or maybe he didn't, I don't know for sure, but he always said he did. But he never set foot in North America. He did set foot in Central America. I think he set foot on an island off of South America. He may have actually set foot in South America. It's hard to tell from the records. After his fourth trip, he was forcibly retired. Among other things, he was given powers to be governor in Hispaniola and places like that. And he was not a very good governor. He was more into the looking for things of value and taking them home kind of guy. He was pretty arbitrary, pretty vicious, as were some of the early Spanish explorers. And so finally he's going to get fired from that job. The Queen, though, feels he's done great service to her, so she always defends him. But he dies not long after his fourth trip. There's his fourth voyage. The Spanish explorers, the ones that actually set foot on land and started claiming land on behalf of the crown of Aragon, Castile, or whoever commissioned them to go, were called the conquistadors, the conquerors, in other words. They were the same, that was the same name used for the ones that were fighting the Moors in the Reconquista. By 1512, they visited almost all the islands in the Caribbean, and the process of all the Indians dying off has started. By 1512, in Hispaniola, there are probably no natives left alive. Some of them died from ill treatment, but most of them died from diseases they got from the Spaniards that they weren't immune to. And some of them probably got smart, jumped in their canoes and paddled to get away from the Spanish. So they're going to start bringing slaves over. The earliest slaves reach Hispaniola probably 1511, 1512. Usually if you read in the books, they talk about slaves coming over in the 1520s. That's when they really started coming over in large numbers over to the Brazilian colonies and what now is, well, all of Brazil, but they were the coastal colonies of Portugal. And they'll start coming over to the Caribbean islands, African slaves will. Let's talk about some of the conquistadors. Don't be writing everything in the slides. Balboa, you don't need to write his name down unless you feel like it. He's going to be claimed to be, anyway, the first Spaniard to see the Pacific. According to the apocryphal story, I wasn't there, so I can't guarantee you this is the truth, but they say he looked out over the Pacific. He was up on a high place on the Isthmus of Panama. He saw the Pacific, and the Pacific's much wider and deeper than the Atlantic, so the water looks smoother. It's not smoother, it's just the waves are wider, so it looks smooth from a distance. And so he said, oh, it's so peaceful, Pacifico. And that becomes the name of that ocean. Whether that's a true story or not, sounds good to tell your kids, right? We all lie to our children, like Santa Claus and all that stuff, and right, the boogeyman, whatever. Now remember, we talked about the Portuguese getting to Spice Islands. The Spanish decided they were going to horn into that one way or another, so they send a fellow by the name of Ferdinand Magellan with a number of ships to circumnavigate the globe and sneak up on the Spice Islands from the other direction. And he gets there, and they set up an outpost on one of the Spice Islands. It doesn't last very long, but it's set up. Magellan's going to be killed over there in that area, but his ship will complete the circumnavigation of the world. So a lot of times we give Magellan credit for being the first man to circumnavigate the globe. Then, of course, there's our friend Cortez. Now, depending on what book you read, his name is Hernando or Hernan. I think it's Hernan. Hernan Cortez de Monroy y Pizarro, or Pizarro. I don't know. Anybody in here speak Spanish? A little bit? Poquito? If you looked at that word, how would you say it? Pizarro? Yeah. The Castellanos tend to make THs out of a lot of hard vowels, like Madrid in Castellano is Madrid, and how do you say supper? Cena, C-E-N-A anyway. The Madriano, the people from Barcelona and all that call it cena.
That's what my family says, yeah.
When I was a young man and a foolish young man and I was working for the agency, I had a Spanish gentleman who was a former, kind of their version of the special forces. And I said, all those lisping sounds make you sound a little bit funny to me. And he offered to cut part of my body off with his knife, and I stopped making jokes about it. Yeah, that accent. We had a lady living with us when I lived in England who spoke Castellano. So I have that influence on me. Anyway, Cortez is over in Cuba. And there's a lot of different versions of the story, but basically he and the governor of Cuba thought it'd be a good idea to go over and look at the mainland. People had already been as far as the Yucatan Peninsula, that part of mainland Mexico that kind of sticks out there that everybody goes on spring break to, if they're foolish enough. They'd already had people there and in the islands off the mainland. So they thought they'd go look at it. My story about how Cortez got to make this trip and other people's stories, the story I was told initially was a great story. So I like the story and I always repeat it, was that he was having trouble getting permission. He wanted to go to the mainland. He wanted to be a great conquistador and get some of the land that you got in return for discovering new places. And everybody had all of the islands in the Caribbean pretty much locked up. So he wanted to go over to the mainland. He had to get permission from the governor of Cuba. And the governor of Cuba wasn't in favor of it right off the bat. So he got cozy with the governor's daughter. And the governor's daughter persuaded the governor to give him permission. Then he dumped her and had to run for his ship because the governor sent people after him to arrest him for being unkind to his daughter. And he got away. And he made it over to where Veracruz is now. I don't have any idea if that story is really true or not, but it used to be in some of the history books. I don't want to say that some historians have imaginations, but it's true. At any rate, he makes it, and we know that the governor didn't want him to go at the last moment. He makes it to around where Veracruz is now. He stopped off at some islands right offshore. He picked up a Spaniard who was stranded over there from an earlier group of people who went over there. The Spaniard had learned to speak some of the native languages, so he picks him up, says, this guy will be useful. He can be my translator. He's also given by the Spaniard, one of his girlfriends, I guess, or anyway, it was a Native American woman who could speak one particularly important language called Nahuatl. Now, if you remember, about 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that language in conjunction with a particular Indian tribe. Can anybody remember? Who spoke Nahuatl? They were the dominant Indians in the Valley of Mexico. They were the Mexicas, or later on we called them the Aztecs. He's heard something about them, and she's going to tell him a lot more about them. And remember what I said, if you dominate people by force and terror, what have you just created? A whole lot of enemies. And so there were a lot of people like this woman who were more than happy to take these strange-looking men who had things like horses and armor and nasty-looking weapons and take them over and introduce them to their not-so-much friendly tribe, the Aztecs. And this woman was one of those. I can't remember the name that's in some of the textbooks about her, but they started calling her Doña Marina later on. That's more of an honorific. And they also called her La Malinche. And some people from Mexico call her a name that I can't repeat in class. Because there's 2 points of view about this woman. One is she was a great traitor because she sold out the Native Americans to the Spanish, and the other people regard her as the mother of the Mestizo people. And they honor her. You know, it's kind of a dichotomy there. You can take your pick what you think about her. We know she had one kid with Cortez. That will figure later on in later exploration, many years later. But she was very important in helping him first of all, make friends with all the Indian tribes around the periphery of the Aztecs, people that didn't like the Aztecs, and get him support to add to his force when he went to visit the Aztecs. He's going to visit them several times. The first time he's going to have to run for the coast because he hears that the governor of Cuba's men have arrived on the coast to arrest him. So he's got to go back and deal with that. And basically he goes back to the coast and convinces them, look, you want to arrest me and have to take that boring trip back to Cuba, or do you want to follow me and be rich for the rest of your life? And so they all switched sides and joined in with his venture, and they're going to go back. He's going to accumulate a lot of Indian allies, and eventually, in between 1519 and 1521, he will have subjugated the Aztec people and basically destroyed their civilization. Little side note about that. Turn around and look at that clock. Is that accurate? Okay, good. I just don't want to overrun with my side notes. Think about this. Cortez is coming to civilize the savage Indians, right? He's coming into a city with a population of about 150,000 people. They have paved roads, they have irrigation, they have a sewage system, they have a good system for agriculture to feed everybody in that city. Can't grow much on this. The city's an island in Lake Texcoco. They grow some of their food on rafts, actually. It's kind of ingenious. The Spaniards are coming over to civilize them. The Spaniards who come from a peninsula in which the largest city was probably Granada, which was large because the Moors made it large, 40,000 people. They had no irrigation. Their sewer system worked like this. You had a little potty in your bedroom, which you used if you had to use one in the evening. And in the morning, your servant, or yourself, depending on whether or not you had a servant, opened the window, out the window, onto the street. That was their sewer system. You didn't want to go jogging in a Spanish city. Or an English city, let's be fair. And yet, these people are coming over to civilize these people. That's a little ironic, isn't it? So, of course, they didn't have human sacrifices. They pointed that out. These people are savages. Okay? You got your religion, I got mine, sort of thing. Anyway, enough about that. One of the other famous Spaniard conquistadors was Pizarro. He's going to subjugate the Incas in between 1533 and 1534. He went through a lot of hardship before he actually got to them. I think 3 expeditions, and sometimes the Spanish government didn't want him to go. Finally, he got on a ship and went all the way back to Spain and got the support of Ferdinand of Aragon to go ahead and try and go to this new area, and he got a lot of authority from him. He's going to subjugate the Incas, and the king gave these encomiendas. If you conquered a place, then you could be in charge of that place, and the people in that place owed you labor or money, and you owed them protection. Sounds kind of like a racket, right? A protection racket. Some years later, the crown of Spain, when it becomes more like really Spain, a united country, they're going to think that over again, and they're going to take all those encomiendas away, or most of them away, and put them back under the control of the crown. Pizarro made incredible amounts of money. His family was incredibly rich. They're going to lose a lot of it because they start fighting amongst themselves after they've gained control of the Incan Empire. Now, both in Mexico, where Cortez went, in Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and all that, where Pizarro's people went to control, initially they go there, and it's all about plunder. Whatever the Indians have, you take. They've got gold or silver, you take it. Fantastic amount. At some stage of the game, though, they're going to actually have to get into the mining business and dig it up. And it was there. down in a place that we call Bolivia now, was a mountain called the Mount El Potosi, I think. It was practically a mountain of silver. Incredibly pure silver deposits there. Eventually they'll run out of this really pure, the pure silver, you could just take it and heat it until the silver melted, and it would run out of the other impurities. Eventually it won't be pure enough, then you're going to have to figure out a different way to refine it. It's going to be more difficult to refine. You get into the mid-1500s, around 1560s, they're going to discover, not too far away from where the silver mines are in South America, enormous deposits of mercury. And if you take mercury, you can allow it to amalgamate with silver. It will form its own little compound. Then you can use that to get it to pour out of the impurities like the dirt and stuff and the other rock. And then you have this kind of loose compound of mercury and silver, and mercury evaporates at a pretty low temperature, so you just warm it, the mercury evaporates and you've got pure silver. That's called amalgamation. What do you know about mercury? Somebody tell me something about mercury. Anything.
Dangerous.
It's dangerous. It's poisonous. Do you know that back in the time of the American Revolution that some American doctors thought mercury was a good cure for some diseases? Well, it was, if you took enough of it, right? You wouldn't have that disease anymore. Carcinogenic, but the people that were really hurt by mercury, cancer didn't matter because they were probably dead before they ever got to that stage. It's going to poison the earth around all the refineries. It's going to be bad for the health of the miners. What do we get mercury in now? Yeah, you get in the thermometers, except most of us use electronic ones now. But what do you all see in mercury? You know, when you go to Wally World and you buy a light bulb, the little squirrely looking ones that look like a curly cube, they're filled with mercury. In theory, you're not supposed to dispose of them in the trash. Did you know that? Everybody throws them in the trash, right? If you break one, you've got mercury in your house. You know that? Oh, but they sold it to us because it was cheaper than the other kind of light bulb. They used less electricity. We're conserving. Of course, we're poisoning the world, but we're conserving. Anyway, these guys discovered that by the 1560s. Moving right on. Cabeza de Vaca gets along the Gulf Coast, goes up the Florida coast. He was based in Hispaniola. Goes all the way across modern-day Mexico, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. Or not the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of Baja California. Comes back to the ruins of Tenochtitlan, or the beginnings of Mexico City. Hernan de Soto is going to go way up into the southeastern part of what is now the United States. Eventually he's going to go and cross the Mississippi. He won't survive it. I think he's going to drown on the way across the Mississippi. And the survivors of his group are eventually going to make their way out to the Gulf of Mexico. Another guy that we all hear about, there's at least one high school in every city in Texas, I think, named after them. Coronado. Of course, there's a lot of restaurants named after the Lujan family, too. He's going to go through modern-day Mexico up into what would be Arizona, New Mexico, the Panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma, all the way up to where Kansas is now. He becomes the first Spaniard to see the Grand Canyon of the Colorado. He's looking for that golden city, El Dorado, never finds it. People keep tempting him to go a little bit further looking for it. The only thing that he finds is a lot of opposition from the Native Americans who don't like him. Apparently the Native Americans out there weren't as nice as the ones like Powhatan and those guys on the East Coast that helped the early English settlers. Of course, the Spanish tended to earn that because they weren't very nice to the natives. We'll talk about that in a minute. When the dust settles, you've got two trade systems here, the Spanish one and the Portuguese. On this map, the Portuguese in blue, coming out of Lisbon, going around the world, past the tip of Africa, into Asia, across the Indian Ocean, through the Straits of Malacca, etc. On the other side, in white, you've got the Spanish going out of Seville in Spain, over to the Americas. Eventually, the center point, the focus point in the Americas will be Cuba. And then they'll go from there to mainland Americas. And with the silver that they get out of Potosi and places like that, they'll go over to the Philippines, which is their connection with China. They'll go to the Philippines, and traders that can trade with China bring all the goods to them there. And then they ship them back to the Americas, back through Cuba, and back to Seville. Let's talk about that a little bit. They had vulnerabilities. What do I mean? I mean, they had weak points. Because if you take things of high intrinsic value, they can be concentrated in small areas, which makes them easier to carry, but it also makes them easier to do what? You can concentrate all that. Okay, let's put it this way. I'm Sanford the pirate, right? Is it easier for me to steal $1 million worth of grain or $1 million worth of gold? Who knows how many ships it would take to get to $1 million worth of grain, right? $1 million worth of gold you can get in one room in one ship. That makes them vulnerable. And they got very defensive about it, so they started making rules like you can only ship gold through certain towns in the Americas, and they'll have to go through Havana, or not Havana, one of the cities in Cuba, Santiago, Cuba, maybe. And then they have to go to Seville. And smart guys like English sailormen and Dutch sailormen. The Dutch, had belonged to Spain, but they're fighting them for their independence, so they don't like the Spanish. And they've got good ships captains and good ships. They're a little country that's practically underwater all the time anyway, so they make all their living by trade. They'll rival the British trade, in fact. Sometimes they'll be friends, sometimes they'll be enemies. But all of these guys, they know where the Spanish gold is. So they just go down and grab themselves one galleon. You catch one Spanish treasure galleon, and you retire for life. You don't need any more. And the British sailors would do that, and they would take it back and split it 50-50 with the crown, especially during the life of Elizabeth. She really liked the sailor boys because they kept splitting these big profits with her. She gave them letters of marque, which made what they were doing, they were basically being pirates. They made what they were doing legal. A letter of marque says you're doing this in the name of the Queen for the country, and now you're a privateer instead of a pirate. The significance of that is, in theory, not that everyone followed the rules, in theory a privateer is just like a soldier or sailor. So if you capture him, he's a prisoner of war, and you have to treat him that way. If you're a pirate, what do they do with pirates? They just put a noose around your neck and run you up on the yardarm. That's the penalty for being a pirate. Anyway, I don't know how significant that was or not. The pictures you see on that slide are all pictures of another group who call themselves the Sea Beggars. I'll make a really long story short as I can. The Dutch were dominated by the Spanish. They were part of the properties of the King of Spain. He inherited it from his grandmother. Okay? Spain was always broke, even when they were taking gold and silver. They always seemed to be broke. The Dutch were very prosperous businessmen, so the Spanish just taxed the Dutch to pay for the Spanish debts. The Dutch didn't like that. Then the Dutch decided they liked what John Calvin believed in, and a whole bunch of them decided they didn't like the Catholic Church. Well, the King of Spain was a very dedicated Roman Catholic. So they're gonna go to war, and the Dutch are gonna start fighting for their independence. It's gonna take 80 years to get their independence, but they'll keep right on fighting. At some point, before they were really fighting openly, Dutch nobles were being told what to do by the King of Spain's regent, who happened to be a lady, one of his half-cousins, maybe his half-sister. And they were a little sarcastic when they kept having to get orders from this woman. And one of them said, well, who do you think we are, beggars or somebody? We've got more money than you do. And after a while, they kind of made a joke out of it and started calling themselves the beggars, the Gusen. And this thing up here on the slide, they made themselves their own emblem. You know, everyone has to have a coat of arms. That's the coat of arms of the Gusen. And what you see in the slide is beggar's equipment, beggar's bag, a beggar's bowl, and other things like that. And that was their little inside joke. They called themselves they were a bunch of rich guys who were thumbing their nose at Spain. Eventually, when they were fighting with the Spanish, practically the only safe place where they were really strong was on the sea. So they started calling themselves the Waterguzen, or in Dutch that would be the Waterguzen. And the translation for that is sea beggar. And so a lot of historians call them, and the English did too, call them the sea beggars. The British on their side had these interesting privateers, and the British all started calling them the sea dogs. And those are the two big enemies of the Spanish Empire as far as England wasn't at war with them, technically. The Dutch were. But they were stealing all their gold, or as much of it as they could get their hands on. Now, it wasn't that easy to get that gold, but so you had to be pretty good at it. Sea dogs and sea beggars. Another problem that the Spanish had in their colonies, the indigenous population hated their guts. They didn't like the conquistadors because the conquistadors were pretty cruel. To be fair to the conquistadors, they were cruel to their own people under them as they were to anybody else. There wasn't a racial thing necessarily. They just were domineering kind of people. The Indians hated them. They didn't too much like the Catholic priests that were coming over, unless they caught the Catholic bug and joined in, because there was tremendous pressure against them. Even the ones that converted to Catholicism felt that the Catholic priests, although they argued against slavery and all that, were treating them almost like slaves anyway. You have to grow food for the mission and that kind of stuff. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about California. Not that many Spaniards. So it was difficult for them to totally control this region, except around the centers, the cities that they founded or formed or built up. And in Spain at home, since they were getting stuff of high intrinsic value that you didn't have to process, gold is gold is gold. What are you going to do with it? You know, I mean, so they didn't develop industry. And that's why their economy is always going to be weak, because economies go with trade and industry and that sort of thing. And they didn't have an economy to speak of. It was, how much money does the king have in the bank? That's about it. So that was one feature of all of this. Let's talk about, we'll go back and look at those vocabulary words someday. Let's talk about some words that come out of all this. You all know the word Reconquista, because that was the process of getting the Moors off the Iberian Peninsula. The Encomenda was this promise of land and people to work the land for you, given by the crown to encourage the exploration, to encourage the conquistadors. Eventually that's going to disappear, and that land's going to kind of be sucked back under the control of the crown. Then there's something called the repartimiento. See the word on the bottom there, mita? That was the Inca way of getting people to work in the mines. It was called the labor tax. And every little village had to contribute so many days worth of labor in the mines. But they were careful not to make them work too many days so they wouldn't starve to death, because they didn't have time to grow food. When the Spanish took over the Incan civilization as such, they're gonna borrow the mita, and they're gonna call it the repartimiento. And initially, it's just a labor tax. Eventually, it will be other things too. It'll be like a trade control, where if you do business, you have to do it through us. If you buy stuff, you wanna buy European stuff, you gotta buy it through us, that sort of thing. There's another term, I think I have it on here somewhere, called the requerimiento. And basically that one, I can kind of make you a kind of a fakey picture of that. Imagine yourself, you're in your little Indian village, and a bunch of guys with metal hats and pikes and horses that you've never seen before in your life, and all of that, come out, stand in the middle of your little village, unroll a scroll, and start spouting Spanish at you, which you don't understand anyway. But what they're telling you is, congratulations, you're now citizens of Spain. Anyone who objects, please stand over there. Right? You know what happened to the people who, please stand over there. They got done talking. He didn't really force them to become Catholics, but it forced them to allow Catholic priests to operate. And it forced them to follow the rules of the Spanish on pain of death if you didn't. Pretty brutal. But what you're going to see in these Spanish colonies is a slow transformation as they stop just grabbing whatever the Indians have and start actually doing their own mining and things like that. And eventually they'll also start growing sugar, especially on the islands more than like mainland South America. That's the next big money thing besides silver and gold. And it's also of high intrinsic value if you think about it. I mean, sugar refining, before you even ship it, you're going to refine it. So there's nothing to be done with it at home except put it in your tea or whatever. By 1650, you're going to have about 500,000 Spaniards in all of the New World. If you spread them out all over South America, mainly the western part of South America, all over Central America, all over Mexico, all over places as far up as Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is founded in 1610, that's not a lot of people, 500,000 people. I mean, we've got a lot of cities that have 4 times that much. You know. The point I'm making is the Spanish population was never really high. That makes it a little bit more difficult to control the people there. The French will even be worse than that, but the French have a different attitude about the local people. What else do we get? We get something, well, let's look at how, in theory, the Spanish colonies were all very rigidly controlled by the crown. You had the crown, and you had this council in Seville called the Council of Indies. They gave orders to the viceroys, who were the overall people in charge of vast areas like all of Mexico and maybe part of South America and all that was called New Spain. And then when you went down to that western coastal area where the Incas were and all that, that would be called New Peru. And there'll be a few other ones later on, but they'll have a viceroy in charge of that. He's the man who speaks for the king. Under him, he'll have what they call audiencias and corregimientos and all other things like that. That's all hierarchical, and it answers straight up the chain. And because the king doesn't necessarily trust all those guys and wants to get all the gold, right, he's going to have an officer of the inspector general, and there'll be one at every level of that hierarchy. You know, to watch the viceroys, to watch the audiencias, et cetera, Then the church itself will have its own hierarchy. So you've got 3 pretty rigid lines of control between Spain and the American colony. What else do you have? You have a pretty strict caste system. What do I mean? It's a discriminatory class system. The highest people on the top of the totem pole are people who were actually born on the Iberian Peninsula, and they call them the Peninsulares. The next people down the totem pole are criollos, not creoles. It's a different word and a different meaning. Criollos were pure-blooded Spanish, but they were born in the colonies as time went by. Below them are people of mixed blood between the Native Americans and the Spanish, and they're called mestizos, which form the majority of the population of Mexico and many South American countries. Probably, the mixture probably now maybe either in between 5 and 10% Spanish and the rest Native. Then you have the Indians themselves, which they called Indios. Why do they call them Indios? Because Columbus thought he'd reached the East Indies. So the natives of the East Indies are the Indios. That's not what they call themselves. Then Zambos, and Zambos were mixed blood between slaves of African origin and the Indians. And finally, at the bottom of the totem pole, are the slaves themselves. By this time, the majority of the slaves were from Africa. Some of the Spaniards tried to make the Indians into slaves. The crown didn't like that very much, and the church didn't like that very much. A lot of other things. When all these Europeans started coming to the Americas, it's going to change not just the Americas, but the world. Because they're also going to Africa, right, and getting slaves. They're also bringing different groups of people together. Native Americans decided that they liked doing business with the Europeans as long as the Europeans didn't try and take their land. Why? Because they had metal things, they had cooking utensils made out of metal, weapons made out of metal, eventually firearms. They liked that. Some of them liked the fire water that the Europeans made. The Europeans, such as the French and all that, also got something in return for that. Fur, the French became, and we'll talk about them, they became interdependent with the Indians. The English got land from the Indians. The Spanish grabbed land from the Indians. In Africa, what does that do? If the Indians, the only way that they can get metal implements and weapons and all that is from the Europeans, it starts making them dependent on the Europeans. If you can go somewhere and make the people that are dependent on you, you've got control of them. It's called dependency theory. People still use this theory. Africa doesn't have any countries that are colonies anymore, but a lot of African countries are dependent on some European country because their banking system or their trade system. That's how they kept on control, even though after they give them their independence. African rulers became dependent on what? They became dependent on the profits from selling their own people into slavery. When slavery ends in the mid-1800s, in most places, what does that mean to the African economy? It's going to go right down the drain. A lot of influence that way, and other kinds of influence. Population decline amongst the Native Americans, maybe 90% of the population dies out. From smallpox, measles, influenza, maybe as many as 95% died in some places. The island of Hispaniola, the entire ethnic, native ethnic group was gone by 1511. They got there when? They got there in 1492. By 1511, no more Indians. Totally gone. The Spanish wanted to do work and stuff like that on Hispaniola. They had to import slaves from Africa. What else? Let's talk about that in a little bit more detail. What else came out of these contacts? We don't need to look at that. You had something called, you can write this down because it'll be talked about, the Columbian Exchange. They named it after Christopher Columbus. Obviously, he didn't do it all by himself. And what we're talking about is the exchange of human population, animal population, plant population, microbial population, between at least 3 continents and maybe more. As a result of this weird conjunction of these different people in this age of exploration. I'll play a game for a couple minutes since we're out of time, or just before you walk out. I think Plainview, I'm going to lose you guys.